Let us now look at quantitative risk analysis. So what is given here is a brief overview of risk assessment. We have qualitative, quantitative, and hybrid. Qualitative is ideal for doing a risk assessment of intangible assets like digital information, reputation, etc. And quantitative is ideal for risk assessment of assets that are tangible. So the fundamental difference between qualitative and quantitative is in qualitative, risk and asset value is calculated in terms of high, medium, low, etc. Whereas in quantitative, the asset value and the risk is calculated in terms of money. So we have already discussed qualitative. Now we will go to quantitative. So if you look at quantitative risk assessment, the different stages or the different steps involved in a quantitative risk assessment is given here. First, the relevant information assets are identified. After that, asset valuation is done. So asset valuation means identifying how valuable the asset is to the organization. So when you value your asset, there are many considerations that you take, and some of the essential considerations that you take when you evaluate an asset is given here. So essentially, it is a measure of how important that asset is to the organization. After that, you identify all the relevant threats to your information assets, and for each threat, you will identify all the relevant vulnerabilities. After that, you will identify the exposure factor. So exposure factor is calculated in terms of percentage. So if I have an exposure factor of 15%, it means if the threat exploits the vulnerability, I am likely to lose 15% of my asset value. After that, you will identify the SLE, single loss expectancy. That is, when a threat exploits a vulnerability, what are the losses? That is one-time losses. Then you will identify the annualized rate of occurrence, which is nothing but the measure of how frequently the threat materializes every year. And finally, once you have calculated the SLE and the ARO, SLE times ARO, you get your risk. So here the asset valuation is done in terms of money value, and the risk is also calculated in terms of money value. Let us look at how quantitative risk assessment can be done. So as an example, we have taken an asset, which is a server. Now, for this asset, the asset value has been identified. So it is 10,000 reals. So for this particular asset, I have considered one threat, that is unauthorized access, and then I have identified the different vulnerabilities that can be exploited by this threat. One is lack of encryption, the other one is use of weak passwords, and the third one is bugs in operating system or application. Now I have calculated or I have identified the exposure factor. It is 15%. It means if the threat exploits the vulnerability, I will lose 15% of my asset value. So 15% of my asset value is 1,500 reals. So this is the single loss expectancy. If the threat exploits the vulnerability once, what are the losses that I can expect? So SLE is asset value times exposure factor. After that, I have to identify the annualized rate of occurrence. So this is nothing but how frequently the threat will occur or how frequently the threat will materialize every year. So the first thing, as an example, I have taken unauthorized access due to lack of encryption. Well, there is a likelihood of that threat occurring once every year. So annualized rate of occurrence is how many times the threat occurs per year. Then unauthorized access due to use of weak passwords, well, it has a likelihood of occurring 3 times every year. And unauthorized access exploiting bugs in operating systems and applications, well, that has a likelihood of 2, twice every year. Now, the SLE in quantitative risk assessment is equivalent to the impact in qualitative risk assessment. And the annualized rate of occurrence in quantitative risk assessment is equal to the likelihood that we discussed in qualitative risk assessment. So whether it be quantitative or qualitative, the approach is the same, the logic is the same. Maybe there are certain changes in the terms that we use. And then finally, we will calculate the risk or the annualized loss expectancy. And ALE, annualized loss expectancy, is calculated from SLE and ARO. SLE times ARO gives your risk. So for the first threat vulnerability pair, we can see the risk is 1500 reals, which means due to this threat and this vulnerability, the organization is likely to lose 1500 reals per year. Whereas for the second threat and the vulnerability, the amount is more because the likelihood is more. Therefore, there is a likelihood of losing 4500 reals per year. And for the third threat vulnerability pair, the likelihood is 2. Therefore, the risk will be, or the ALE will be, the loss of 3000 reals per year. Now, once you have done the calculation of the ALE or the risk, now it is evident which you have to prioritize on. The losses are more in the second case, so you have to focus on that first. Then the next applicable losses are the third threat vulnerability pair, so you have to focus on that next. So once you have done an entire quantitative risk assessment, you will calculate the risk, and once you have calculated the risk, you will focus on the higher losses first, and then you will go to the remaining losses.